Shalom, everybody, and welcome. My name is Yishai Fleischer, and I'm standing right now in the heart of Judea. You know, you may believe that the Jewish people have historical rights or biblical rights to the land of Israel, but when the word international law comes in, you may get a little afraid because the haters of Israel are always using the term international law against Israel. Well, there's actually an amazing and beautiful story of Israel's international law recognition that happened 100 years ago in San Remo, Italy. That's when the Allied powers that were the victors of World War I got together to dismember the lands controlled by the Ottoman Empire and hand them to indigenous local peoples, including the Jews. I'm going to be speaking with some awesome experts, Colonel Richard Kemp from the British Army, Jake Bennett about the text, the legal text of the Mandate for Palestine, and Rabbi Mike Foyer about the spiritual aspect of the recognition of Israel by the international community. So stick with me for a journey that goes back 100 years to San Remo, Italy, at the beginnings of the recognition of Israel in international law. All right, folks, we are celebrating 100 years since the San Remo Accords, which was the first and maybe deepest international recognition of Jewish rights in the land of Israel. And this segment, I am joined by Colonel Richard Kemp. Richard Kemp is a retired British Army officer, served from 1977 to 2006, completed 14 operational tours around the globe. He spent most of his life fighting terrorism and insurgency. He's commanded British troops on the front lines, including Afghanistan, Iraq, Balkans, and Northern Ireland. He even chaired an intelligence group. Maybe not everybody in the world knows about it, but it's kind of famous in England. It's called the Cobra Intelligence Group, which is responsible for coordinating the work of national intelligence agencies, MI5 and MI6. That's cool stuff. His book, Attack Red State, about war-torn Afghanistan, was a Sunday Times bestseller. But for the purposes of this discussion, it's also important to note that Colonel Kemp is an outspoken critic of the international community's stance on Israel and regularly writes and comments on this issue. He's involved with several pro-Israel organizations. I've heard him speak about this many times. And in a sense, for me, Colonel Kemp is exactly a throwback to those incredible men that lived 100 years ago and desperately wanted to see the reconstituting of the Jewish state in the land of Israel for various reasons. We're going to get right to that in a second. Colonel Kemp, welcome to the show.
Yishai, thank you very much. It's really good to be your guest on this. And as always, it's great to be talking to you. Even though I can't see you in person, I can see you on the screen. And it's really good. As you pointed out to me just now, you're always a fun guy. So it's a great pleasure.
That's right. And I love your room back there. It really, there's a lot of war type of paraphernalia there. You've really been in battle for more than 30 years now with your other battles that you're in. And it reminds me of some of the great generals of the past. For example, General Allenby. And General Allenby is leading the British in World War I, pushing back the Ottoman Turks. And he's coming up the coast from Egypt. He's coming up to Jaffa. He's coming through Gaza. He's fighting there, having a tough fight, coming up to Jaffa. And finally, he's making it up to Jerusalem. And all the while, when he's in process, there's already a kind of effort to turn on the idea that the Jewish people are going to be given the opportunity to reconstitute their presence in this land after the British free this land from the Turks. So I kind of wanted to ask you about your perspective on 1917, 1916, 1917, those ideas at the time, and that British general who's walking up to Jerusalem, and when he finally gets into Jerusalem, dismounts his horse in order to give respect to this holy city.
The year 1917, I think, probably was the single most significant year that led to the recreation of the Jewish state eventually in 1948. And there were two things really, and you've certainly touched on one of them, and you've also touched to an extent on another one. Two things occurred in 1917, which led to I think more than anything else, to the recreation of the Jewish state. The first of them was the Balfour Declaration, the British government's policy decision to encourage and enable the establishment of Jewish national homeland in the then land of Palestine. And secondly, and I think actually at least as important, possibly more important than the Balfour Declaration, was the campaign you just spoke about, General Allenby's campaign to throw the Ottoman Empire out of Palestine and other parts of the Middle East, and conquer it for Britain as part of the war effort. Let's not forget that campaign was part of a defensive war after the Turks attacked the British in Egypt. So it was a defensive campaign in which the British were victorious. When I say the British, obviously it wasn't just British. It was also Australians, New Zealanders, people from other countries as well, part of the British Empire fighting. And one element of that battle, which isn't really well known over here, it's probably well known in Israel, but isn't too well known over here, was the role of Jewish people from Palestine that formed an intelligence group called Nili. And Nili was a fundamental element of General Allenby's success. Without the intelligence that was passed by Nili, the Aronson family, who were the sort of backbone of Nili, without the intelligence passed by them, General Allenby's own chief of intelligence has said that he would not have been able to win that conflict in the way he did. Eventually, maybe won, but with many more casualties, and it would have taken longer. So that's a fundamental thing. And the other point I think that we should bear in mind when we talk about this subject is that not in 1917, but the next year in 1918, when Allenby concluded his campaign and threw the Turks completely out of the region, a fundamental part of that was the Jewish Legion, part of the British Army, the first formed Jewish fighting force since the time of the Maccabees. The 38th, 39th, 40th and 41st battalions of the Royal Fusiliers, collectively known as the Jewish Legion, who were formed by Colonel John Patterson in 1917 and actually fought for the first time at Megiddo in 1918. And those brave Jewish soldiers, many of them came from the UK, many came from Palestine itself, some came from the United States of America, Russia and other countries around the world to form this incredible organization that played a key role in defeating the Turks, and of course went on to become, in some respects, the founding fathers of the IDF. Many of the people that fought in the Jewish Legion, and of course fought later, others, younger ones, fought in the Second World War. Many of them from both of the wars were pretty important in founding the IDF. And just very briefly, if I may, John Patterson was a British-Irish colonel, not Jewish, Christian, who after the war, he went to live in the United States of America, and he died in the USA. He was buried in California, and he became a close friend in the US with Prime Minister Netanyahu's father, Ben-Zion Netanyahu, the famous Zionist and historian. And he became so close to him that he asked him to be. I'm not an expert on the Jewish religion, but the equivalent in Judaism of a godfather, as we would have it, to his oldest son, Yoni. And in fact, his oldest son was named Yoni after John Patterson. And of course, Yoni subsequently became the hero of Entebbe. And then after when Patterson died, he died in 1947. His wish was to have been buried among the Jewish soldiers he led in battle in Palestine in 1918. But because of the time, it was 47, as I said, it wasn't possible. But a few years back now, his remains were exhumed from California and reinterred in a Jewish military cemetery where his soldiers had been buried, in a ceremony presided over by Prime Minister Netanyahu. And I was very fortunate in being able to be there myself.
That's awesome. And that's awesome that you were there. I forgot the part that you were there. I knew the rest. That must have been a special feeling for you because, you know, the UK, the story of the UK's involvement in the rebirth of the Jewish people is very significant. I have a fabulous book right here, which is called The Balfour Declaration by Elliot Yeager. Great book, by the way, and talks about some of the fabulous British people that were involved. And we'll get to a second what their motivation was. But there's also been dark times. You and I, before the show, discussed that we wouldn't get into it too much. But you're the kind of British person who sees the story of Israel as a just story, a rightful story. And it must have been very special for you to be at that reinterment of General Patterson in the land of Israel, a British soldier, by the way, famous for many other things, not just Zionism, including killing these man-eating lions. And yet he's buried here in Israel. It must have been a special moment for you.
It was an incredible moment. I knew a lot about John Patterson, and of course, I knew a lot about many other British military and political leaders who have also been very, very strong supporters of Zionism, and then later of the State of Israel and the Zionism of Israel. And coming to mind immediately is Orde Wingate, another very famous British officer who, in the 1930s, again not Jewish Christian, in the 1930s, he on his own initiative, because of the feeling he had for the Jewish people in the land of Israel, he taught the Jewish farmers and people living in the land at the time. He taught them how to defend themselves against marauding Arab bands who were trying to kill them and drive them out back in the 1930s.
Yeah, he was the original anti-terror trainer.
Right, absolutely. And he taught them to not just defend yourself in your village, go out and get the enemy, go out at night, get them, kill them when they're not expecting you, and deal with them. And that was, a lot of his philosophy became the kind of policies that are still used today by the IDF. And in fact, David Ben-Gurion, the first Prime Minister of Israel, said that had Orde Wingate, remember a British Christian officer, had he not been killed in the Second World War, he was killed in Burma in the Second War as a general in an air crash, and later buried in Arlington Military Cemetery in Washington. Ben-Gurion said, had Wingate not been killed in the Second World War, he would have been the first Chief of Staff of the IDF. So the first Chief of Staff of the IDF would have been a British Christian officer, which is actually something incredible to think of. But there have been others, obviously people like David Lloyd George, who was the main figure behind the Balfour Declaration, Balfour himself, Winston Churchill. More recently, we had people like Margaret Thatcher, Tony Blair, our current Prime Minister Boris Johnson, many prominent British figures, that perhaps the best of our leadership, have always been staunch, strong supporters of the Jewish people and of the State of Israel. I just want to mention one other military figure who no one will have heard of, I'm sure, but he's somebody who's quite special to me personally, and he was a guy from my own regiment. I was a member of the Royal Anglian Regiment, which was formed from a number of earlier county regiments, including the Suffolk Regiment. And the Suffolk Regiment, during the period of before Israeli independence, was based in Palestine, was over there. And they were told, you're moving back, you're going back to Britain. And there's then going to be a war. The Arabs are going to invade. And they were basically told that the Arabs are going to defeat the Jews in that war. And in fact, Field Marshal Montgomery, the head of the British Armed Forces at the time, he gave, I think, the Jewish people just a matter of weeks to hold out after the Arabs invaded. Anyway, one of these guys in the Suffolk Regiment, my regiment, was called Ringo Watson. Again, he was a Christian, British, I think a corporal or a private at the time. He wasn't a senior officer. Wow. But he realized what was going to happen, and he was not willing to go back to England and just from a distance watch the Jews getting annihilated. He had to fight. So he deserted. When his regiment went, he stayed illegally. He kept his machine gun with him. He went and joined the Haganah, and he fought in the Battle of Jerusalem, was wounded in the Battle of Jerusalem, fought throughout the War of Independence. And after the war, he remained in Israel for a while. And then later, as these things tend to happen, he met a Jewish girl and married her. And then a bit later on, they decided they would go back to England. He didn't really want to just live as a kind of a criminal, effectively, for the rest of his life, away from his own home. So they went back to England. He actually took his machine gun back with him as well, that he'd taken to fight in the War of Independence. In those days, you could take a machine gun on a plane, no doubt, dismantled. But and he handed himself in. He was court-martialed, did a short period in prison because, if you desert for selfish reasons, that's different. But if you desert to fight, then you're looked at a lot more leniently. And so he did a short time in military prison and then served on in the British Army together with his wife there. And he became a sergeant major and retired just a few years ago, died a few years ago. And
Wow.
his name was legendary within my regiment, Ringo Watson, John Ringo Watson, his name. No relation to the Beatles, any of the Beatles.
That's an amazing story. That's an amazing story. Now, that leads me exactly to my next question. There were various motivations at the time for British support for a Jewish state in Palestine, in the land of Israel. They were various. For example, T.E. Lawrence was actually in favor of Zionism as well, really because he was in favor of supporting local peoples to rise up against the Turks, the Ottoman Turks, support the British, be allies to the British. And so he saw the Arabs and the Jews not very differently. He helped turn the Arabs against the Turkish rulers. And so too, he said, okay, the Jews are also part of the equation here. They're an indigenous people in this land. They're living here. They could be good for the British Empire. And he supported both of those indigenous peoples as having self-determination and turning against the Turks. So that's one very geopolitical reason. Another geopolitical reason was that the UK wanted continued control over the Suez Canal. And the friendly Jewish state, the proto-state, would help them ensure control over the Suez Canal. But then there was one other motivation. There's others, but one clear one, which was a love and a connection with the Bible. And you had that with David Lloyd George. You had that with Balfour. These are people who were steeped in biblical tradition, in reading the Bible. Balfour's mother read him the Bible every night. And they recognized these places, and they felt that this is their great, and here it also bifurcates into two different rationales. One is the great opportunity to reconstitute the Jewish Commonwealth, and another one is to fix some of the wrongs that were perpetrated against Jews by Christendom, and they felt themselves to be emissaries, people who could fix a historical wrong, right a historical wrong by doing this thing. And they were very, very passionate. So I wanted to ask you a little bit about these various motivations of the British Empire at the time in 1916, 1917, 1920 at San Remo for the creation of a Jewish state.
Yeah, I mean, there's no question at all that the motives were varied, including self-interest on the part of the UK. And I should just say again that it was really Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, and remember he was fighting a tremendous fight in the First World War. It was certainly not the outcome was certainly not able to be foretold. There was no absolute definite prediction that we would be victorious in the First World War. Many thousands and thousands of British soldiers, American soldiers, later French, were being slayed in the war, as well as Germans, of course. So it was a terrible time. And, I think the challenges, even today, challenges faced by, for example, our Prime Minister over here, Boris Johnson, and your Prime Minister there, Benjamin Netanyahu, with the coronavirus thing, I think pale into almost insignificance compared to the tremendous challenges he faced. So he was looking for every possible way he could of achieving victory. And you mentioned the desire to maintain control of the Suez Canal, obviously very important. But another very important thing was to keep allies on side and try and harness our allies around the world. And the Jewish people were seen, Jewish people in the United States, I think in particular, but also elsewhere, were seen as being fundamental to that, because they played, in many cases, they played significant roles within their own society. And I think that was part of the motivation, not the whole motivation at all, but part of the motivation for the Balfour Declaration and for Britain essentially befriending the Jewish people in this way. And I think one thing we shouldn't forget, because people will talk about the Balfour Declaration as an embodiment of British foreign policy, which it was, but it wasn't British alone. Before Balfour made the declaration, he secured the agreement of all of the major countries in the world that we weren't fighting at the time. So that includes the United States of America, it includes China, it includes, pretty much every other major power, France and so on, that we weren't actually involved in combating. So it wasn't, the Balfour Declaration wasn't just, it was portrayed purely as a British political instrument, but it wasn't just that. It was as it was later enshrined in San Remo, it was it was an international agreement, and he garnered international support for it. But I do agree with you also that I'm sure both Balfour and Lloyd George were both Christians, and Lloyd George in particular, he was a Methodist from Wales, and he saw a lot of commonality in both the religion and in the nature and character of his own country, Wales, with the future Jewish state. And so I think he had a great deal of sympathy. And you find people like Ord Wingate later on, and John Patterson. These also were religious men, and they were partly motivated by the inspiration of the Bible. And that does go for many, I think, many people, many non-Jewish people who are fervent supporters of Israel. Personally speaking, I'm a Christian as well, but my support for Israel is not, I mean, it's obviously, if anything, reinforced by my knowledge of the Bible, which is not as great as it should be, but certainly not as great as people like Ord Wingate. But my motivation is not, my personal motivation is not about the Bible. I am a Christian, I am a Zionist, but I don't consider myself a Christian Zionist. In other words, motivated by Christianity. A lot of my motivation is knowing right from wrong, and of course that comes from my Christian upbringing as well. But I do recognise first of all the rectitude of the Israeli cause and the wrongness, the absolute black wrongness of those people who want to destroy the state of Israel even today, and there are many of them, not only in the Middle East but in the West as well. But also the virtue that Israel has for the whole of the world. And I've worked closely with the IDF, with other Israeli state organizations, including intelligence services, in my professional career. And I know how much our country, Britain, and also the rest of the Western world, and most of the world itself, and not even outside the West, owes to the state of Israel in terms of, forget about trade and economy, but in terms of just things like technology, military technology, medical technology, intelligence. Israeli intelligence has saved so many lives around the world. And we're fighting the same fight. Israel and the UK and Europe and the US and the Western world is fighting the same fight against the same enemy. And to me, it's important that we stand with our friends and oppose, in union, oppose our enemies.
I think that makes a lot of sense. And I think also in general, I've come to this conclusion in life that when something is true, it has many layers. It has many layers of truth. And it could be true on a biblical plane, on a reconstitution plane. It could have been good for British foreign policy with their strategic global situation. And what you're saying is another side of it, which is the justice of the Israeli cause, and also the how should we say it in one word? The usefulness, the good, the light that comes out of Israel for the world. It's important for people that aren't so familiar with it to understand that the Balfour Declaration was fully included into the San Remo Accords, and Arthur James Balfour was actually there in San Remo and making sure that was going to happen. It was incorporated, the idea that there was going to be a Jewish state, and that happened 100 years ago, really today, 25th of April, 1920 in San Remo, Italy. And later, 2 years later, a document was formulated, the mandatory document, which is a fabulous document, which recognizes Jewish rights in the land of Israel. It doesn't grant, but recognize. It talks about reconstituting. It talks about a right of return. And it also talks about a system by which minorities living in the land will be respected, will have civil rights, will have religious rights, but not necessarily political rights, because the folks back then saw that there was going to be Arab states formed through the mandate. But this one was meant to be a small Jewish state. So it was going to be strong Arab states and one small, strong Jewish state. And that's how we were going to have regional harmony, shall we say. Maybe not peace, but harmony. Sadly, that attitude did not prevail. But that was the original vision.
Can I also, Yishai, can I make one further point, which sort of complements what you said, which is that not only was the Balfour Declaration essentially made part of a legal treaty at San Remo, and then in the British Mandate, or the League of Nations mandate for Palestine, handed to Britain. But also the rights of the Jewish people, as well as the Arab peoples in their countries, were enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations when the United Nations was first founded. So the legal rights of the Jewish people to their own homeland in the land of Palestine, now called Israel, and then called Israel as well, but you know, that more widely known as Palestine by that. It's not just some anachronism from history. It was enshrined in the UN Charter, and of course, you know, since then, obviously after the mandate was given to the UK. We said we weren't going particularly to speak about this, but I'll just mention it. After the mandate was given to the UK reneged on that mandate. And why did the UK renege on it? Because the UK came under enormous pressure from the Arab population in the Middle East to restrict Jewish immigration or even prevent any Jewish immigration into the land. And Britain succumbed to that pressure, I'm afraid to say. Churchill hated it. Churchill stood up against the government as it sort of caved into this Arab pressure. But it maintained, and it persisted right the way through. That same pressure and Britain's same policies persisted right the way through until the War of Independence in 1948, and even beyond then. But I'm very pleased to say that today, I think, Britain has has in many ways, certainly officially in terms of the government, has restored its previous stance towards Israel. We are, I'd say Britain and Israel, apart from maybe Britain and the US, we are two of the closest allies, and it's based partly on trade and economy, partly on military and intelligence cooperation. I don't think there's any closer intelligence allies in the world than Britain and Israel, the United States, etc. So it's often below the radar horizon because of the political sensitivities, shameful though that is to say, of openly and positively supporting and backing Israel. I do believe that that's going to get even better. It's good at the moment. I think it's going to get even better as Britain completely leaves the EU, and we're able to shrug off the EU's overwhelming anti-Israel stance, and hopefully revert to being, again, the people that directly led, I think, to the recreation of the state of Israel, as I mentioned, through both the Balfour Declaration in 1917 and the destruction of the Ottoman Empire in 1917, 1918. And I think, I started off by saying I think that the military campaign by Lord Allenby in 1917-18 was at least as significant as Balfour Declaration. The reason I say that is because if he hadn't defeated the Turks in the land of Palestine, then why would they not still be running it today? Why would they still not be there today? And if they were still running it, would there have been a Jewish state recreated? The answer, of course, is a very resounding no.
Well, you're absolutely right, and I want to, I honor you as a kind of emissary of that way of thinking and acting, all the way from General Allenby to yourself, to Boris Johnson. And yes, we there were also dark periods, but today we celebrate the great periods, and today we're celebrating 72 years of Israeli independence, Jewish independence in the land of Israel, and also 100 years since the San Remo Accords, which brought the Balfour Declaration out of just British policy, and it was even less than policy. It was like a kind of position paper into international law, and really began the process of reconstituting the Jewish people in the land of Israel. Colonel Richard Kemp, you're a great fighter around the world for British interests, but you've also been a great fighter for justice, and within that, the cause of Israel. I want to thank you and wish you a happy Yom Ha'atzmaut.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure speaking to you. And I hope to see you soon in the promised land.
That's right. As we say, next year in person, right?
I hope this year.
Very good. Richard, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much, Yishai.
All right, and we are joined by Jake Bennett, who is the Director of State Legislative Affairs at the Israeli American Coalition for Action. He's also a guy who served in the IDF and a special forces unit, one of the best ones in the country. And he's also a good friend. Jake, so great to see you all the way from Phoenix.
Thanks, Yishai. Great to talk to you.
Jake, I want to also wish you a very happy 72nd Yom HaAtzmaut, Israel Independence Day.
Thank you very much to you too. This is
know,
one of my favorite holidays.
Tell me a little bit. You served in an amazing unit in the Israeli army. You work in pro-Israel advocacy and activism and legislation and pro-Jewish legislation around the United States. Tell me how 72nd year of Israel's independence feels to you this year.
Yom HaAtzmaut, Israeli Independence Day, feels to me like a combination of July 4th and Passover, Pesach, because you've got that element of the political freedom and then the history of the Jewish people, the national Geulah, the redemption, the coming back to the land of Israel, which this year the calendar worked out that Pesach was actually very close to Israeli Independence Day. And you have, as you mentioned, Yom HaZikaron and Yom HaShoah. So this is a day that to me is really a redemptive, happy day that also brings together all of that Jewish history, 2,000 years of exile, the Shoah, where my grandmother was a slave to the Nazis in the death camps, but survived, and my grandpa hid out in the woods, and a generation before that, Jews were dealing with pogroms in Eastern Europe and starting to rebuild the land, to restore Jewish sovereignty. And here we are. So it's a beautiful day, always a little bittersweet. The Yom HaShoah and Yom HaZikaron leading into it really makes us appreciate, as we should, the magnificence of the time that we're living in all of Israel's wars.
And the incredible self-sacrifice of our parents, our grandparents, and friends. And this year, Yom HaZikaron, I remember Ari Fuld, a buddy, and also a great warrior for Israel on every front. And so, I remember one of my commanders in the army who was killed, Tom Karin. He was killed in an action with in a battle with Hezbollah in 1996. So I remember all those folks and others. And so you're right. It's bitter. It's very, very sweet, but we remember the bitterness of losing friends and comrades. And we, of course, remember the Shoah. What people don't know is that 100 years ago this week in San Remo, Italy, the powers that got together, that defeated the Ottoman Turks and the other members of the Axis, the Allies got together and decided what they're going to do with the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And on April 25th, they decided to incorporate, April 25th, 1920, they decided to incorporate the Balfour Declaration of 1917 into a new system that was going to be called the Mandates, in which the European powers, the French and the English, the British, were going to rule different parts of the Middle East with the hopes of mentoring these places, these countries now into self-governing, strong, independent states. Amongst them was going to be Palestine. Palestine was going to, of course, be Jewish Palestine, a Jewish state. And that was decided on April 25th, 1920, that they were going to incorporate the Balfour Declaration. They were going to make sure there was going to be a Jewish state. And maybe that was one of the greatest moments of the foundational moment of international law, of the Jewish state in international law. And what we're going to read now is we're going to read a document that was finished off about 2 years after that, that was there to complete the idea that happened at San Remo, that there was going to be a mandatory for a Jewish state. And so in 1922, they got together 2 years later and wrote up a document to crystallize what a Jewish state, what the process of creating a Jewish state was going to look like. Is that a good summary, Jake?
That sounds good to me, yeah.
All right, so let's go to the text. I'm going to use our handy-dandy screen share here. Tell me where I should go.
Let's go to the preamble.
All right.
And let's start at the second paragraph that starts with whereas the principal allied powers. And just read those two paragraphs because that gets us started.
All right.
Whereas the principal allied powers, are you there?
Yep, I'm with you.
Okay. Whereas the principal Allied powers have also agreed that the mandatories should be responsible for putting into effect the declaration originally made on November 2nd, 1917, by the government of His Britannic Majesty, and adopted by the said powers in favor of the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights and political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country. And whereas recognition has thereby been given to the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and to the grounds for reconstituting their national home in that country. So there we have some key ideas: the historical connection of the Jewish people with Palestine and reconstituting their national home.
Right. So the importance of that is that they're not granting Israel any right that didn't exist beforehand. They are there to recognize the Jewish kind of natural rights or self-determination rights, which was the language of Woodrow Wilson at that period, right? So they're here to recognize that Jews have always been connected to this place, and they're going to reconstitute. What is this reconstitution? It's the reconstitution of two commonwealths that existed beforehand, and now there's going to be a third one. And so
Right.
the language of international law is not of granting, not of dividing, not of doing anybody any favors. It's like, you guys have a natural connection to this land, a natural history in this land, and so we're going to recognize that and help reconstitute that. That is an incredible language that is so missing in today's discourse. Am I right, Jake?
Yeah, absolutely. There was an important letter by Churchill, who was the who played an important role in this period about a month earlier, where he said it's essential that the Jewish people should know that it is in Palestine as of right and not on sufferance. That the Jewish people have a right to be there. They're not there because some people are doing them a favor. They're not allowed to be there because some people are doing a favor. They're allowed to be there because they have a right. And that's a key concept.
Right. And this idea that you have a natural, organic connection to this land. You have your history here. And what we're facing today, if only that paragraph could be made part of the general discourse today, which is we're going to recognize your historical rights, and we're going to help reconstitute a state that you've already had. There's no Arab Palestine in these places. We have not stolen anybody else's land. We have a natural connection to this land, and we're certainly not white Europeans who came in and stole somebody else's land. We are the indigenous people of this place, and so it was recognized. It's important to understand that 1920, I think there were four Allied powers that got together, and it was Japan, Russia, the UK, and France. But here, this mandatory was ratified by 56 members unanimously of the League of Nations. So we're talking about full international law that was accepted by the whole international community of that time. And later, when the United Nations was formed, it accepted all the decisions that the League of Nations took beforehand. So this is the real controlling international law. And this document is the real. It's the real. Remember that old commercial? Where's the beef? Here's the beef. Okay, this is the real stuff of the underpinnings of the Jewish state. Let's get to the next text. What should we read?
Yeah, let's skip ahead. Article 2 reaffirms that, talks about the establishment of the Jewish national home again, but let's skip ahead to Article 5.
All right.
Article 5 is very brief. It says the mandatory shall be responsible for seeing that no Palestine territory shall be ceded or leased to or in any way placed under the control of the government of any foreign power. Okay, that's pretty powerful. And that comes in.
What's the basic meaning of that paragraph?
That this land, this whole land that's being recognized as the mandate for a Jewish homeland, is the Jewish homeland. So we see a lot of challenges to that in the 100 years since. We've seen jihadist challenges on the basis of Jewish sovereignty not being allowed, racist challenges on the basis that Jews are not indigenous, as the rest of the world had called them indigenous to this place for 2,000 years, but were somehow colonialists, and and we've seen calls for the partition over and over again of the land of Israel.
Uh-huh. So this phrase basically says this. Now, you're very good with the numbers. What are we talking about in terms of how much of this is the part of the former Turkish Ottoman Empire?
So this area was 40,000 square miles. It's the size of Virginia. This was 4% of the Ottoman Empire. Okay, so when it ends up getting broken up by the British, and the area east of the Jordan gets partitioned for the first time, the original two-state solution, and you have Arab Palestine and Jewish Palestine. They give over 3/4, 77% of the land, 30,000 square miles, to Arab Palestine. What's left, instead of being the size of Virginia, what's left west of the Jordan River is the size of Maryland. What happens now, 25 years later, when you get to the UN partition proposal, which was not a binding law but a proposal, was a further partition of that land. What you ended up with 2 years later, with armistice lines after Israel's War of Independence, was minus 20% of that. So Israel it shrinks from the size of Maryland to the size of New Jersey, and that area that is the so-called West Bank, known historically as Judea and Samaria, that's about 2,000 square miles. The rest of Israel is 8,000 square miles. Those 2,000 square miles, to help people understand what this means, it's the size of 3 counties in New Jersey or 3 counties in Maryland.
So this article was like, look, this is the Jewish homeland. Don't cut it up. Don't give it away at anybody. Don't try to shrink it. This is the classic land that belonged to the Jewish people. And so the mandate, let's look at it again. The mandate is supposed to make sure that nobody takes away this land and that they shouldn't cut it up. Now, Jordan, it's a long story about how they were able to cut out Jordan. But the point is that anybody today reading this Article 5, the mandatory shall be responsible for seeing that no Palestine, and today you would have to add Jewish Palestine, because people don't understand that the word Palestine is actually, in this case, absolutely, unquestionably meaning a Jewish Israeli Palestine. So for seeing that no Palestine territory shall be ceded or leased to, or in any way placed under the control of the government of any foreign power. So you really couldn't be clear that what is the intent here. The intent here is to keep this place Jewish. Don't cut it up. Somebody's going to come around. Somebody's going to come around and say, hey, this is my land. No. International law recognized this is nobody else's land. And I think even in the discourse of the deal of the century, today, it would behoove us to recognize that there should be no discussion, really, of giving away this land to any other foreign power or government. And that I kind of wish that the deal of the century today would look like the deal of the century a century ago, right?
Yeah.
Do we have any other?
Century ago was a pretty good deal.
It was a pretty good deal. It was a pretty good deal.
It
was, you know what, but you know what, Jake, that makes me want to clarify one thing, which is that it's not a good deal for the Jews and for Israel. It's actually a good deal for Middle East stability and prosperity. And the peace plan of 1920 was very simple. Strong Jewish states, let me say that again. A strong Jewish state surrounded by strong Arab states.
Yeah. And it was recognized a year earlier at the Treaty of Versailles in the Faisal-Weizmann letters, where Chaim Weizmann of the Zionist organization had met with the Emir Faisal, who was to be the leader of Syria in this post-war world, who said, as long as the Arabs get our independent states, I'm happy and fine with the Jews having their state. Right. They belong there anyway. They're going to bring the best scientists. It's a beautiful letter. You've read it. They're going to develop this state, and they're going to develop the region, and we're going to grow strong and together. And that was a beautiful concept. And the idea that that you could have Arab strength and independence in all the Arab lands, and Jewish strength and independence, and be friends and Abrahamic cousins and in partnership, was an idea that that could have taken off, but we know where the world's gone in the last 100
Right.
years,
But what a simple,
and it still could.
right, exactly, what a simple outlook. This is a region of ethnic national states. That's not a bad word. It's a nice word. And in the 20s, it was certainly seen as a nice word. You have an ethnic national Jewish state, ethnic national Arab states, a Semitic region, an Abrahamic union, and they're all strong and doing their thing. Nobody's trying to, and we'll get to this in a second, nobody's trying to get rights to undermine the Arab nature of the countries around us. No Jews are trying to vote out the Arabs in their states, and no Arabs are trying to vote out the Jews in their state. This is tribal regional lands. This is the Jewish protectorate. These are the Arab areas. And that's how we're going to get along, by that understanding, by that respect. And the clear-eyed time that of the 20s, where it was like they were post-World War I. They wanted a world that was going to be stable. It didn't work out for them, but they had a clear-eyed vision of how to put these powers in consonance with one another. One more thing, T.E. Lawrence, the famous Lawrence of Arabia, he orchestrated the Arab revolt against the Turks, and he basically said to the Arabs, you're going to get liberty, you're going to get these Turks off your back, and you're going to get regional self-determination. That's the same thing he thought about the Jews. He thought the Arabs were going to get self-determination, great. And the Jews, which is basically another type of Arab tribe, a Semitic tribe right next door to the Arabs, from the same type of family, they too are going to get their self-determination. And these peoples are going to get states, and they're going to be living in liberty without the yoke of the backwards Ottoman rule. So that was the vision of the time.
Absolutely. And at the time, to put it in context, this was the liberal vision, because remember what preceded it. What preceded it was spheres of influence, conquest, colonialism, and then you had this concept of these ethno-national states of indigenous independence. T.E. Lawrence and Amir Faisal went to Versailles and joined Chaim Weizmann in convincing some British Foreign Office people who were against this idea of Jewish independence that no, this makes sense. T.E. Lawrence was on board, Faisal was on board, and recall that in this document, and we can get to this, but there's also another very liberal idea, which is that there would be civil and religious liberties for everybody in the land.
Well, let's get to it. Let's get to that right now. Let me share my screen. Where are we going to? Which?
Well, let's see. Next, before we get to that,
where's the article about?
Let's go. Yeah.
Go ahead.
You want to jump to civil liberties?
Yeah. I just want to get to. I want to make the point that we're making right now, which is that for non-Jews living in the land, there was going to be an anchoring of civil and religious freedoms and rights, but that is as opposed to national rights, meaning to say you're going to have civil liberties. You're going to have the right to congregate and say whatever you want, et cetera, and you're going to have your rights to religion, but you're not going to be able to vote in that Jewish country because we don't want to give you the right to vote out the Jews in their small protectorate. And that's probably what was envisioned in the Arab states as well. And it was just clear-eyed. So the Jews, you're going to control this area. You're going to rule it. You're going to have minorities. You got to treat them right. But that doesn't mean that you got to give them the driver's seat to try to take over the country. Or in other words, and here's the important point for today, Israel's not Jewish because it's a Jewish majority. It's not Jewish because democratically speaking, it's a majority of Jews in the land. Israel is Jewish and was envisioned to be Jewish when the Jews were still a minority. There were more Arabs in the land than Jews, but it was still understood that this is a Jewish state. Today, thankfully, the situation has been reversed, and we have a lot more Jews than Arabs, which is good because this is the national home of the Jews, but that's not the reason that Israel is a Jewish state. And I think that's in the text. Can we see that?
Yeah, bear with me to re-find that.
Right. So we were talking about. I think we have it in the preamble. It's right in the preamble. It says, it being clearly understood that nothing should be done which might prejudice the civil and religious rights
Yes.
of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine.
Right.
And interestingly
And
enough,
again in Article 2, it's reiterated in Article 2.
let's see that again. And also safeguarding Article 2 of, and we're, now let's just make it clear what we're talking about. This is a text that was finished off in 1922. This is the mandate for Palestine, which was based on San Remo, which happened this week, 100 years ago, April 25th, in 1920. And it says, and also for safeguarding the civil and religious rights of all the inhabitants of Palestine, irrespective of race and religion. So civil and religious rights, certainly, but not democratic voting rights. Democratic liberties, but not necessarily democratic voting rights.
Right. Because it could have challenged the very Jewish immigration that this Jewish national home was to be based on. And there we get to Article 6, where we, if you want to pull that up.
I'm pulling it up right now. Let's get to Article 6. Go ahead.
Article 6. The administration of Palestine, while ensuring that the rights and position of other sections of the population are not prejudiced, shall facilitate Jewish immigration under suitable conditions and shall encourage, in cooperation with the Jewish agency referred to in Article 4, close settlement by Jews on the land, including state lands and wastelands not required for public purposes.
All right.
So what you have there is another element that gets challenged in the world today, in the anti-Israel world today, the law of return. The law of return, which is a concept that's applied in many European countries, in many democracies. In law, it has a term, jus sanguinis, which means that by virtue of your heritage, you have a right to citizenship in this place. And here the international world, the League of Nations, recognized that Jews have been recognized for 2,000 years as coming from this place and had a right to be in this place, to get citizenship in this place and immigrate to this place. And there was an anti-Jewish immigration movement at the time from people who didn't want the Jewish state. But an important thing to note is that at the same time that Jews were moving in to build the country, you had Arabs moving in from all around the region. So you had Arab population growing dramatically while the Jewish population was growing. So it's not that these immigrants were taking away jobs and opportunity. They were creating jobs and opportunity.
That's right. The Jewish state is actually one of the main sources of work and prosperity for local Arabs, and could be also a great partner for regional prosperity if the jihad would kind of evaporate, and instead a spirit of cooperation, a spirit of the Abrahamic Union, the Semitic Union would take place, the spirit that we saw that Emir Faisal had, and many Arabs that I know, many so-called Palestinians that I know, who wish to see that day where Israel will be sovereign in its land, where there'll be residents of Israel with upward mobility, with prosperity, with opportunity, and that Arab countries around us would be our natural trade partners. I want to wish you an amazing Yom Ha'atzmaut. Thank you for being a fighter for Israel in every way, including being a super soldier here in the land of Israel, and also today being the Director of State Legislative Affairs for the Israeli-American Coalition for Action, which is just such an awesome, awesome job. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Yishai. Thank you for everything that you do. It's a pleasure to be on the show.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach to you. Leitov.
All right, we want to welcome Rabbi Mike Feuer, who's an educator, a counselor, and also the creator of a history podcast called The Jewish Story on the Land of Israel Network. He's a history buff and a great teacher, and also an awesome rabbi. Rabbi Mike Feuer, first thing, Chag Ha'atzmaut Sameach, Happy Israel Independence Day. And also, yeah, just want to ask you about like a spiritual perspective. Like, how do we look at this crazy thing where we had nations beforehand, like the Romans and others, Crusaders and Muslims, coming into our land, occupying it, taking away our sovereignty, destroying our sovereignty. And here you had the world gathering together saying, hey, Jews, we recognize that this is your homeland? How do we see that in historical, spiritual perspective?
Well, first of all, I mean, after a rough couple of millennia, we see it as Chazdei Hashem. We really see it as the grace of God, and as a confirmation that a promise remains unbroken. And that's an important perspective, because it was not a simple process, and we're not even at a simple point in that process. But I would say, is if you pull back a little bit further, that what comes to my mind when you want to talk about the spiritual perspective of San Remo is what are known as the three oaths, which I'm guessing you're familiar with, but for anyone who may be watching who's not, if you look at the end of the Gemara in Ketubot, you'll find an Agadata, right? This narrative sort of, not just storytelling portion of the Gemara, but exploration of thought, where the rabbis say that Israel was bound into exile with three oaths, which means that there's a whole world which comes into being around the destruction of the Second Temple that we've lived in since then. And those three oaths are, number one, Shelo Ya'alu Kechoma, right? That Am Yisrael shouldn't come up en masse as a wall, literally. And it's generally understood that means that we're not supposed to fight our way into the land.
So the Jews are not supposed to. The Jews aren't supposed to come in and bowl through, like come in on a huge army and just take it over in strength. That's an oath that we somehow accepted, says the Talmud, right? Okay.
Well, whether we accept it or not. I mean, when God binds you with an oath, it's kind of non-consensual or not. So,
Okay.
but it's a reference, if people are familiar with the history, to the fact that at the turn of a different era between the destruction of the first temple and the construction of the second, the end of the Babylonian exile, there was a criticism of the Jews who didn't come up Kichoma, right? We didn't come up en masse. Most of the Jews remained in Babylon. So apparently that was an opportunity to repeat that sort of Joshua-like conquest. Once the Second Temple is destroyed and the great exile that we still are struggling to leave completely now comes into being, so that's one of the oaths. That method is off the table. The second one is not to rebel against the nations, right? And this goes to the heart of the rabbinic conception of what history basically is, frankly, since the destruction of the First Temple. We have to remember that sovereignty, the idea of kingship, that someone not only makes the rules, but holds the context that allows the world really to develop its relationships. Sovereignty for Am Yisrael finds its fullest expression in a society that is able to bring the presence of God back to earth, right? The temple in its fullness, the Shekhinah, God's presence dwelling, that has not existed in the world since the destruction of the First Temple. And if you open up the book of Daniel, you'll see there at the second chapter a vision of what it looks like when sovereignty was taken away from Am Yisrael, when the hope that there could be a kingdom of flesh and blood that could actually represent the kingdom of God in the world. It was taken away, and it was given over to the nations who may be just, may not. They may be good, they may not. But what they don't have is the capacity to represent the kingdom of God on earth. That was taken away and will return in some visionary time. And because of that, sovereignty belongs to the nation. So the sages said, we're bound not to rebel. I mean, we say dina de malchuta dina, right?
Mm-hmm.
The law of the king is indeed the law. The third oath is
so we have to. So in short, we have to accept the yoke of the nations. We can't rebel against them and say, I'm not listening to you anymore. They have some say in the matter, and until we have kind of a green light, we can't go to the land of Israel.
It's deeper than say.
In rebellion.
I would say it's deeper than say. They are the context for the world right now.
Mm-hmm.
Or the world, and that's why San Remo is so important. Because don't forget that, like, the San Remo agreement, as you pointed out, sort of lay at the base of the entire League of Nations process, which itself eventually grew into the United Nations, which means the entire concept of international law, of international sovereignty, that the world is a grouping of nation states who relate to each other as equals despite the very obvious disparities in power and economics, etc. That concept of national self-determination lays at the base of the current context of society. And right there at the base is the fact that the Jewish people have a right to be sovereign in our land. Right? It's a recognition that we, despite our dispersed nature and our difficult history, belong in our land just as much as the Mesopotamians belong in theirs. So the third oath, just to get the complete picture, is that the nations actually was not just binding on Israel, but on the nations. That the nations shouldn't depress Israel too much. And we happen to be recording this on Yom HaShoah, so for me, it's always a little bit of a bitter pill. Like, what does it mean they shouldn't subjugate us too much? Well, we know now. They may not have known before this. You might have thought at different times, the Inquisition or the Crusades or whatever, that was too much. No, we know what too much is now.
Okay, so you have these three oaths. The first one is don't bowl your way into the land of Israel. The second one, don't rebel against the yoke of other nations. And the third is actually an oath on the nations, don't torment the Jews too much.
Too much.
One can argue that those three oaths have somehow been unlocked. Okay, maybe the Jewish people did not go up in kind of in strength in a massive force, but came in drop by drop into the land of Israel until they grew more and more. Two is that the nations, instead of causing us to rebel against them, basically gave a green light, a recognition, not a granting, but a recognition of Jewish rights in the land of Israel. And thirdly, the Holocaust is a, how should we say, an abrogation of the prohibition against torturing the Jewish people. They just overdid it. And so all of those are kind of green lights for the Jewish people to return to the land of Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a shifting in the whole context of exile toward, it's a turning of the corner, if you will, toward redemption.
That's very powerful.
That's how I think of it.
And it's been 100 years. I think there's something powerful about that. Like 100 years. It's been 100 years since that decision. Sadly, though, I guess the only question mark that's out there is after San Remo, the British themselves, who were the mandatory, they were the ones that were supposed to be responsible to basically tutor Israel and other countries into freedom, into self-determination, started turning their back on the Jews. And the UN, which is the inheritor of the League of Nations, instead of going in the pathway of Balfour and the San Remo Accords, turned a direction and went the other way. I told my wife that this is a little bit like Egypt when Pharaoh finally released the Jews into the Exodus, into leaving Egypt. Suddenly turns around and says, "Wait a minute, what have we done?" Right, and we got to chase them and stop this process. Of course, the process is, once it's out the door, it's not stopping anywhere. But I guess that's a little question mark of why have the nations reneged on that beautiful, beautiful moment. And I just want to add one more point, which is the founders of the Balfour Declaration, if it was David Lloyd George, if it was Balfour himself, and many people around that, they were very sad to see England and this whole process start to going the other way. And the people that took over for them in the British government were not people of the Bible, as these Balfour Declaration people were, and they were not people that saw the great opportunity to reinvigorate the Jewish people in the land of Israel, re-embody the Jewish people in the land of Israel. And so it was like a beautiful moment 100 years ago. There were even Arab factions headed by Emir Faisal, who met with Chaim Weizmann, exchanged beautiful letters, and really saw, to quote Shimon Peres, like a new Middle East. And somehow that was somehow that was.
Shimon Peres was there at the Paris conference.
That's a good joke. But there are these moments of beauty, and somehow they were lost, and from then on we actually have to fight for it. So how do you explain that in the context of what you said?
Well, you have to remember that the Paris Peace Conference in San Remo came in the wake of World War I, which was really conceived of as the war to end all wars. It was more horrific than anyone had ever imagined. It was also, in many ways, almost an accidental war. I mean, true that very few wars are really premeditated on that scale, but there was a sense in which a world system had grown up organically, which was completely unstable. And when it broke down, it exploded in a way that no one expected. And therefore, in the aftermath, there was an opportunity to take those lessons to heart. Right, Woodrow Wilson's vision of national self-determination was a very important part of that. This sort of sense that humanity had a unique opportunity to reorder the world, to borrow the phrase from Isaiah, to beat their swords into plowshares and really end war. But what happened was that needs a narrative. If you're going to do something like that, you need some vision, because it's going to demand a lot of things. It's going to demand a lot of growth and change. It's going to demand a new way of organizing. It's going to demand something like breaking up the world empires, not for your own self-interest, but for the interest of the peoples there. But instead, what emerged out of it, as you're pointing out, was a new power game. Britain wasn't prepared to give up its colonial power. Neither was France. Neither was Germany, even once they recovered from the beating that they'd taken, and the very fact that they didn't finish the job and left Germany unconquered in World War I in many ways led directly to the resurgence and World War II. So, but what I would say is that the difference between, say, 1920 and 1947, between what I've heard you call the San Remo narrative and the United Nations narrative, right? There are many differences, but one of it is that by 1947, the experience of the people around the tables there was the gates of Auschwitz and the mushroom cloud over Hiroshima. They no longer had the faith that the world was going to be a better place. They were just trying to clean up as much of the mess they could and feeling a tremendous guilt over the fact that they had allowed the things that had occurred to happen. Right? And whereas there was a sense of almost messianic hopefulness that surrounded San Remo.
And there was also one other element, I think, which is very important, and that is the element of the Bible. The Bible was an important player in the minds of the people that wrote and disseminated the Balfour Declaration. They really lived with the Bible. I read that Lord James Arthur Balfour, he was schooled by his mom, and she read to him from the Bible every single night. And when he was at San Remo, he kept on saying to them, well, how I envision the map of Israel is from Dan to Beersheba. Okay, he really saw, and that phrase was a recurring phrase in his lips. Sure. He even said at some point that he understood the British position in the Holy Land better than he understood it in various places in Europe and in various battlefields. So the Bible played a major role at the UN, and maybe on today's campus and in other places, maybe at CNN and the New York Times. The Bible doesn't play so much of a role. People don't feel themselves to be characters in the Bible. People don't feel themselves that the Jews are the heroes of the story, that Israel is rightful in the hands of Israel. So we've it's a bit of paradise lost, right? Because you kind of, or I like to say paradigm lost. There's a certain paradigm that got lost, and it hasn't really come back yet, except for, interestingly, amongst Jewish people themselves. I think there is a resurgence in a connection to the Bible, either within a sense of tradition, or maybe a sense of real religion, like a sense of serving God, or like Ben Gurion, who saw it as a book of history that guided us to where we're from and where we're going.
Yeah, and I like the image of paradigm lost, because in many ways it wasn't just a paradigm lost, it was all paradigms lost. And that's really the difference. San Remo was the height of the modern era, where the hopefulness of the power that humanity could wield, both on a moral and a technological and political front, had not been overwhelmed by the horror of war, but actually in many ways, it had convinced people that now was the time to act, and that was what the attempt was made. Whereas by 1947, and certainly today, that hopefulness is gone. The idea that there's a story, like you're saying, that the biblical narrative is a meta-narrative for humanity, that the Bible can be sort of a scaffolding to build a better world beyond sort of the classically religious perspective or beyond the historical perspective, that it actually contains a wisdom, be it in the book of Daniel, be it in the 5 books of the Torah, wherever you see it, that it contains a wisdom that will allow us to build a better world, that Israel is a hero of a story. There are no heroes in the postmodern era.
Right.
There are only victims and perpetrators.
Right. To the
only victims and perpetrators. A hero is just, listen, it's important to understand this, because our claim to heroism, a hero is just a perpetrator with better PR. And that's what you get out of the campus response to the biblical narrative today. Oh, you Jews aren't different or better. You're just using the Bible to cover up your evil. You're actually Nazis on the inside, just like everybody else. And sadly, we feel that sometimes within ourselves. But the reality is that every biblical hero is flawed and struggles with the question of power, right? That doesn't mean they're not heroic.
Right.
And I think that that's a lot of what's been lost.
Yeah. Well, I think that on the one hand, it's been lost. But on the other hand, we do see a moment where for the last 72 years, today we're celebrating Israel Independence Day, we have seen a tremendously heroic moment. Yes, there's elements that try to erode that, but we are going to be celebrating. I think the people in the state of Israel are going to be celebrating. I think Jews and lovers of Israel throughout the world are celebrating. I think they're celebrating with us right now on this video. And I just wanted to finish off with you, Rabbi Mike Feuer, and kind of ask you, how do you celebrate this day? Like, what is its meaning to you, especially the confluence of both Israel Independence Day together with 100 years since San Remo. It's this year. 72 is a beautiful number. 100 is a beautiful number. Like, how do you understand Yom Ha'atzmaut, this Israel Day of Independence?
So Yom Ha'atzmaut, the first thing that always comes to my mind when I think about it is the name itself. I mean, I love the Hebrew language. It's a language that we're taught that it was actually the means by which God creates the world, and therefore it's always worth it to delve into the nature of a word. And independence is not a particularly Jewish concept. It's important to remember that. Is that we are a people who are meant to express God's sovereignty in the world, and not just in the sense that we all are an expression of the divine will, but also we're a people for whom the collective, that Am Yisrael, really takes a center stage, and that each of us as individuals, of course, is precious and important in the whole world, but that we're meant to be expressive of and to serve the mission of that collective. So independence is a dicey word. Atzmaut, in many ways, is a much more profound and more Jewish concept, because etzem, of course, is the thing itself. It's the nature of thing. Atzmaut is self-actualization. This is a day of self-actualization. And that's, I think, where Yom Ha'atzmaut and San Remo really come so beautifully together. Because what the nations did is recognize that, especially men like Lord Balfour, that because of their religious and biblical vision, that what the world needed was a platform to be able to take it to the next level of expression and actualization. And that's the role of Am Yisrael. It's the role of the Jewish people. We're meant to serve. We're meant to serve God. We're meant to serve the world. And of course, to serve also our national interests. And the beauty is that none of those contradict. But it only works, the expression that Archimedes said, if you give me a lever and where to stand, I'll move the world. Well, we as a people, the Torah is our lever. The land of Israel is where we're meant to stand. And our mission is to actually move the world. So that's really what I see in the sense that we've been gifted with a return to our land and the opportunity to sort of regroup and recoalesce here as a people in a way in which we haven't been able to do for a couple of thousand years. And the only other thing I would add to that is it's very important to me on the day itself to spend a little bit of time feeling the dream. That we're living the dream of 2,000 years. And not just from the sense of privilege and I don't want to feel guilty, the survivor's guilt, but just simply the joy and wonder of it. Because reality is national life is messy. It's complicated. I have to tell you, probably better than me, if that's even possible, how messy our situation is. But you know what? It's a blessing. Even the problems we have are problems of blessing today. And so it's a day in which to feel the fact that we're living the dream of 2,000 years and to rejoice at the opportunity to be able to actualize ourselves as individuals, as a people, and ultimately in service of the divine vision for humanity as a whole in a way which we could not do for millennia.
And we have been given a great gift, and I really appreciate spending time with you talking about that amazing gift. It really is.
My pleasure.
We've spent a lot of words on it, but in many ways it's ineffable. There's no words for it. The massiveness of this incredible time, this incredible gift of being that generation that is getting to be re-embodied in the land of Israel and really fulfilling that great dream of 2,000 years, that those dreams of all the individuals and God's dream as well. Rabbi Mike Feuer, you're both a rabbi, you're on the faculty of the Pardes Institute, you're a counselor. A lot of people come to you for help, and also you're a teacher through your history podcast called The Jewish Story, found at jewishstory.co and on the Land of Israel Network. Thank you so much for being with us today.
It was my pleasure. Thank you.
Hey folks, thanks so much for joining me on the broadcast. We went back 100 years, all the way to April 25th, 1920, to San Remo, Italy, to learn about the origins of Israel's rights in international law. In preparation for the show, I was aided by two books. One was The Jewish People's Rights to the Land of Israel by Salman Ben Zimra and put out by our friends, Canadians for Israel's Legal Rights. It's a great book, and this is actually a draft copy handed to me by Solomon himself. He later passed away, so this show is dedicated to his memory. And also the Balfour Declaration by Elliot Yeager, a great book, amazing story about the people behind this incredible miracle of the recognition of the rights of Jewish people to reconstitute their state in the land of Israel. So thank you very much for being with me and celebrating 100 years of international law rights and 72 years of independence. God bless you from the land of Israel, from the land of blessings. See you again on this awesome journey of the Jewish people's return to the land. Shalom.